in 3, 2, and 1.
Good morning, our special guests from Europe, and good evening, the participants from China, Asian. So welcome back to Digital Futures Doctoral Consortium. So today it's a great honor for us to have Patrick Schumer coming back to make the second lecture named Exclusive Competency and Universal Scope of Architecture. So yesterday, Patrick actually gave a special framework of the future architect, the first lecture, which is based on his very important book, Autopoiesis of Architecture, I think, which is a subtitle for that book. And tonight, the second lecture, the topic goes to the exclusive competency. So which will make some discussion on the re-foundation of discipline as modern architecture, switch from the edifice to space, avant-garde versus mainstream, cumulative versus revolutionary periods, differentiation of art and architecture, differentiation of architecture and engineering, Niklas Luhmann, his most important theory of modern society. So let's welcome Patrick, and the screen is yours.
Great. Thank you again, Philip, for inviting me. It's really nice to have that platform 6 times.
Yeah, exactly.
The great context of Digital Futures, a wonderful initiative, global initiative. So it's really happy to be here. Sorry, guys, yeah. My eyes are a bit swollen from an eye infection, so I will. Okay. I chose this fashion item to help me with that. Let me share my screen because it helps to have some. I'm not going to show images again. I will just have some slides. I want to go through some of the theses which are formulated in volume 1 to address the topics which Philip just listed, which were listed in the syllabus. Okay, let's see. Okay, yeah, I think I can do it this way. 1 second, I have to also get into this. So lecture 2. It's still connected to the first volume. Before I go into the addressing a number of theses, the title of this lecture was Exclusive Competency and Universal Scope of Architecture. So I think what we need to realize, and that first of all, I'm thinking of architecture and the design disciplines as one universe of discourse. That's what you found already in the Bauhaus. So it's urban design, architecture, interior design, industrial design, product design, graphic design, as well as fashion design. And that's also, you know, the way Zardid Architects, we see ourselves as a global design brand and firm covering all of those domains. So why am I talking about exclusive competency? So that's a critical element of what I call the autopoiesis of architecture. Basically, what we're looking at in the modern era, and particularly in the 20th century and continuing in the 21st century, that we have these great disciplines or discourses, I would say, and in terms of Niklas Luhmann, who's been a great inspiration, the great function systems, that's his term, of society structure the overall process of competency and innovation as well within modern function differentiated society, which is basically contemporary society. And that means that in terms of our field, we need to realize that the totality of the built environment and the world of artifacts in terms of its physiognomy or phenomenology, in terms of its look and feel, and the way it presents itself to our senses, is determined by designers, by us and our colleagues. And that's become more and more universal in scope, because now we also have to include, for instance, landscape design in that. So if you live in urban environment, there is nothing which you can confront and counter which hasn't been designed by a colleague. And that also includes all what we encounter and experience virtually or through media, through for instance, the internet. Because also here we have colleagues, I mean, the website designers, framing the and designing the way things appear. So the world of appearances is the world of the designers. Of course, there's also, you know, aspects of the content of what and the social processes which are framed by all these phenomenal framings, then of course they're not in the domain of architecture. So they might be in the domain of the economy, they might be in the domain of political processes, in the name of industry and production, etc., and other cultural conditions, of course. But the form, the framing, what I call, is always a colleague and designer, and we have the universal and exclusive competency. So there is, and more that we see that every aspect of our surroundings, phenomenal surroundings, is authored by a professional designer. And what is important to reflect is that this professional designer, it participates in the global discourse of architecture and design. That means they are been gone to a school, to an architecture school or design school, and they're reading key texts. They're aware of key protagonists in the field, and they're participating, you know, in that discourse. And that means everything which is created, everything which surrounds you, and that also is, you know, the exterior of your iPhone, as well as all the graphic and apps and interaction potentials on it, as well as everything physically surrounded, is done by a professional designer who is in touch with and aware of what all of us are doing. And I think what is beautiful about this, the contemporary condition, so let's put it this way, I mean, everything which is created in here and now has an awareness, for instance, of Zardine architects, for instance, of something like parametricism or modernism, and other key figures which are universally known and in universal reference points, and also key texts. And that's been like this, you know, throughout the 20th century to some extent. I mean, you could say that everything which was created, I mean, it wasn't as universal in scope. There were more vernaculars and creations and crafts which were not connected up with the universal discourse of architecture and design. But now I think that's pretty complete. And what is fascinating about it, that this discourse has opened up and democratized hugely in recent years through the internet, through, you know, sites like Design and Archinect, and through Instagram and Facebook. Every young designer and architect can throw something in and can contribute to the visual reservoir of references and being picked up and being influential and influence everything which is happening from tomorrow. You throw something on the web today, which gets some notoriety, goes around and becomes viral. Will, you know, as from the next day, every new dress, every new building, every new industrial design, every new product will potentially be influenced by this. And that is what I call the discourse of architecture and design. And that's precisely as it evolves through this discourse, is the autopoiesis of architecture and design, meaning the self-making, because only designers and colleagues and people initiated into the discourse with a degree of competency and knowledge and facility they will generate the values which are current, the arguments which count, the reference points which matter and become influential. All of that is internal to a discourse. So that is the self-making of architecture discourse. There is no strong external influences. Yes, there are influences external into general audiences, their market behavior, what they like and dislike, to some extent filters through, but it has to filter through key figures within the field who take position and articulate what they perceive maybe market conditions to be, or historical conditions, opportunities to be. There need to be spokespeople, creative protagonists with a voice who mediate maybe external pressures, external opportunities, influences, what Luhmann would call perturbations. They become communications within the autopieces of architecture, within this architecture, within the system of communications that is architecture, only through colleagues and protagonists who are part of that, expert parts of these discourses. I mean, you can enter, in various ways through this. Mostly we have now, I would say 99% of participants have been schooled. And some of you who are talented and quick-witted can start entering and joining before they've completed their degree. So there is obviously no certification process and no real barrier of entry, but it's just that if you want to have a voice, you need to be clued in to some extent. Anyway, so that is the exclusive and universal competency of the discourse of architecture and design with respect to the totality of the world as artifacts and phenomena, which we confront and which frames basically everything we do as designers, frames the life process, frames the interactions, the communications, which then, and productive activities which take place within these spaces, take place within and through media which are articulated and framed by us as designers. So I just wanted to throw this out there, which is, which is quite an important responsibility. The way I'm expressing it, I want to give you a sense of responsibility, but also thrill of empowerment, because as I said, as you enter and join these very open platforms of communication, you can launch a message which really shifts the discourse and affects everything, which will then be created around the world to continue to build that built environment and world of artifacts. It's the totality of the world of artifacts and built environments, both physical and virtual. So I think that's worth noting, and importance and thrill of joining this discourse. And I think that's, this started, I'm calling it the refoundation of the discipline of architecture and design as modern architecture and design. This universal scope really happened in the 20th century through modernism, through places like the Bauhaus, where also, even, for instance, industrial architecture, housing for the masses, mass housing, and what we now call social housing, the mundane and ordinary became the scope of professional designers, whereas previously, in previous eras, it was only a select set of elements, key, churches, key palaces, maybe a key public buildings were designed by, inverted commas, professional architects. I mean, those who were part of the autopists of architects, people like I was mentioning the other day, like maybe somebody like Palladio, somebody like Gottfried Semper, Schinkel, all those figures, for instance, of the 19th century, Sir John Soane and Ruskin, influencing the design of the parliament. They had only, that 1% of key iconic, inverted commas, these phrases didn't exist at the time, public buildings of significance, and the rest was still tradition-bound building, was still just the vernaculars. And that in the 19th century gradually transformed with more and more scope. And then after the socialist revolutions or social revolutions, First World War, I was mentioning yesterday, and with the establishment of modernism, that became truly and self-consciously a universal claim. So if you read somebody like Le Corbusier, he is literally, talking about the design totality of the industrial civilization in terms of its artifacts, spaces, urban patterns. Everything becomes part of a rational discourse where you argue for, through treatises and books and papers and manifesto projects, you argue for the direction in which the phenomenal, let's say, expression of this civilization should take shape. So that's the refoundation of the discipline of architecture as modern architecture. Is precisely that claim of universalization. Otherwise, of course, the discipline was existing with, I was talking about yesterday, with the scope and capability of anticipating and simulating complete buildings. Even the design of a city district, or ideal cities, were at least on paper designed, and some were built in the late Renaissance, as well as theory and complete simulation with perspectives and renderings and light and shadow simulation. So you got that capacity in architecture, but you didn't have it with that universal scope, which modernism then applies to this. And also modernism sees it very clearly. You see in the Bauhaus that it's this kind of total scope from the cutlery or spoon to the totality of the city. And if you look at Le Corbusier, it's fascinating that he is also making drawings and plans not only of a singular industrial city. Then you have this idea of linear cities, and he's basically drawn the urban structure of Europe. I mean, I wish I had found that image, and I've seen it somewhere in the book somewhere. So basically what Le Corbusier is doing, they have the whole map of Europe, and he's placing a series of urban centers, some of them existing, and then he's drawing these linear cities, these corridors of development between, and generates a rational construct of the totality of the built environment of Europe. And if you then go to the 60s, it seems partly ironic, but you have this idea of the mega structure, the idea of large-scale development. The 60s really are the main takeoff point of modernism, that total takeover, inverted commas. And you have, maybe you can say they're partly ironic, you have super studio with the infinite city, the continuous city, where this and you have some people starting to draw up a linear city wrapping the planet. So embracing the planet on the equator with the continuous loop ring city as mega structures. So, I mean, these are just, let's say, obviously exaggerations and symbols when I'm talking about this, but that gives you the sense where we were with modernism in terms of the universal claim, universal scope. But of course, since then, we still maintain that. So I think this discipline has, and since then we have expanded the realm. As I said, we used to have a graphic design, so framing all of written communications. That was already in the Bauhaus, with developing typographies, developing graphic designs, book design. These are all colleagues, and it matters because how you structure the artifact. I mean, it's pretty a standard thing, a book with the frontispiece, with the list of context, the chapter breakdown. How do you clarify internally with paragraph structures and indents and fat print and cursive print, etc., etc. How do you structure and make legible the organization of the content? The content itself, of course, is not the architect's or the designer's business, but the framing through, for instance, graphic spatialization is important. And since then, obviously, we have expanded into the whole realm of web design, where all contents of human culture, appeared. But how do you design the interface? How do you navigate and move through? What kind of tools you have of juxtaposing text and image? And now we're obviously spatializing this, and it becomes into the domain of the architect. But I've always thought, and that was clear in the Bauhaus, but also in institutions like the Wuchemas, as I mentioned, and many other schools of architecture. You have that integration of all design disciplines into one discourse. And I will come to this because everything around, you could say the formula is framing communicative interaction or framing communication and framing communicative engagement is a formula which fits all design disciplines, from the graphic designer to the urban designer, as well as the idea of the key categories that we're distinguishing form and function. And basically that lead distinction of the discipline implies that we can, we can put the whole task formulation for all design disciplines in that formula, giving form to function. For instance, that applies to all design disciplines across the board. And what we need to focus on with respect to the design disciplines, giving form to function means giving form to social function. And as I said, the technical aspects of functionality we need to incorporate in our thinking, obviously, as constraints, but ultimately the responsibility for those aspects rests with engineers. They rest with, and also the innovation of technical constraints, the overcoming of technical constraints usually rests with engineers, although architects can push as proto engineers. And this distinction between the engineer and the designer exists not only, of course, in architecture, it exists in urban planning, urban design, with infrastructure engineers versus urban designers. It also exists equally in the industrial design, where you have designers like Los Roughgrove and maybe Philip Stark, etc. What they're in charge of is the look and feel, the ergonomics, the social functionality, what you can and can't do and should do and might do with the artifacts, and the technical. There's always an engineer working with them to make sure the technicalities are similar with let's say web designers. You have those who are working on the surface with the UX, UI conditions, and then you have the coders and the underlying technologists. So that's a universal distinction you have now in with respect to all the phenomena, the world of objects, artifacts, and environments, and including in fashion. You have obviously the technician. There would be the tailor and material scientists, etc. And the designer is responsible for the semiology, the interaction, the dramaturgy of how do you open up that dress, and it's it's social functionality. Anyway, so this is something which I think gives you a good global overview of where everybody here as a designer fits in. Of course, there are design specializations. And even in our company, we have those architects, and some of us has been specializing into interior design, which is more detailed, with a more detailed view and experiences, as well as industrial designers. Although we quite quickly can cross these boundaries, because the overall ethos and discourse that giving form to function set of principles and other categories like the aesthetic values which we bring to bear, the idea of a semiology which is brought to bear, all of that is across all of these specializations. They are within a unified discourse, whereas the engineers don't share those categories. They don't have any conception of aesthetic values, for instance. And when they talk about functions, this is purely a technological, physics-based operation, and not for instance, a form of phenomenological or semiological function or social function. So I think it's very important to understand the overall division of labor in the development of, for instance, the built environment. So it is not all just us. We are just the ones who are in charge of, and you might, the ordering, spatial ordering, and the morphological articulation. So how these things appear and become transparent, become legible, and how we would like to take social meanings and give them formal symbolic meaning, semiological registration. This is within our domain of competency. But with that, let's say these aspects of the built environment, we have exclusive and universal competency, meaning that engineers can't tell us what to do. They can give us options and constraints we must consider, but there's always, 50 ways of realizing something technically, and then we make final selections on the basis of social functionality. And I think in a mature relationship with clients, that's quite similar, where they give us a sense of the processes, the social type of events, the kind of maybe crowds they want to attract, and what they want the experience to be like. They're giving us some description in terms of some text, some description, some agenda, maybe also some commercial agenda, if you like. And they should not interfere how we translate that into, let's say, a semiological system, into a spatial system. They will obviously look back at what we're producing, and we have to produce hyper-realistic conditions, and give us a critique whether they find it, knowing their clients, knowing the kind of events they want to host, whether this is a good fit or not. So they can give us negative critique and saying, go back, show me something else, or I don't like that, give me something else. But they can't positively tell us what they want. If they start interfering and start to guide the design too much, their position, I think, is the one of selection, of articulating that there is a sense of misfit still, but they cannot make things fit. That's very important. And wherever you have clients pushing too hard and determining the design, that design is most probably will not have any standing within the discourse of architecture. It will actually become some kind of vernacular, which it won't have any status and respect and proper authorship. So, okay. With that, I want to just go through some of those theses to go a bit more deeper in some of those points. So basically what I've done in the 2 volumes, I had 24 theses in volume 1, so from 1 to 24. And then I have volume 2, I have another, I have going from 25 all the way to 60. And I will today go through some of those theses in volume 1. Why am I trying to condense the writing into thesis? I think it's very helpful to condense, let's say, the final messages, which can be put into a poignant, sharp formulation, like a thesis. I always found it very helpful that one remains aware of, when one is writing and thinking through and elaborating a theoretical apparatus, developing a terminology, developing a series of explanations and descriptions, that this must lead somewhere. It must lead somewhere where you can conclude, inverted commas. So each paragraph is concluding or headed with a thesis, and these theses, they have hopefully, in particular in volume 2, becomes more poignant and more action oriented. So the thesis has a chance to bring something to the point, as it were. That's why I've been doing this as a form of self-discipline, and also as a good communication tool, and one of the various summary conditions a big book requires. So you can read through the contents list and contemplate how is this structured, what are topics which are rehearsed here and built up, and you get a sense of what the book contains. And at the end, you can look back and see what actually were the conclusions, which were the poignant thesis, which were condensed out of that. I think that's a very important way, because if you have a large piece of writing, people might just go in there and write, and afterwards say, oh my God, what does it all add up to? what are we looking at it here? I mean, this seems to be, you know, and I think I have another some, you know, attempt at the summary, a number of several other attempts at summaries within the book itself. I will show that later. There's a big kind of matrix, all the categories, comparing the architectural categories to categories in other major function systems. For instance, that's the big tableau, like you know, inspired in a way by the Renaissance, where a lot of knowledge was condensed into these big panoramic maps. They weren't usually grids, they were usually concentric images based on the idea of the city with something in the center and then radiating in segments. So that's an interesting, this kind of synoptic view. I have something like that. I will show that maybe tomorrow. That's anyway my plan. And also I have, for instance, in volume 2, I go back and look at the whole of my theory, what I've developed through in the various categories and topics I'm addressing, and how am I, let's say, concluding on each of the topics. I compare that, I step back and compare that to a series of other, basically the 3 other major treatises using the same set of topics or the same conceptual grid to make that comparison, for instance, between the Discourse of Architecture as well as through the theoretical articulations of Le Corbusier 100 years earlier, or not quite 100 years, let's say, yeah, nearly 100 years earlier, with Towards New Architecture and the City of Tomorrow. So that's one comparison. And then I'm going back to Durand and his lectures on architecture. That's the second comparison, another 100 years back. And then I go back all the way to Alberti, another 300-400 years back, where we again looking at comprehensive self-description of the discipline of the function system of architecture. So I have that matrix of Alberti, Durand, Le Corbusier, and my book. So the book reappears once more in a panoramic comparison, again to try to give ways of self-reflection, give ways of absorbing the overall panorama, inverted commas, which I'm trying to unfold in this book. So that's just the background of trying to find these mechanisms of summarizing and different forms of summary. And so therefore I've come up with these theses. So for instance, let's just go into some of them. Thesis 1 is architecture as autopoietic system. So it comes to the very concept of autopoiesis. And basically what I'm saying is here, the phenomenon of architecture can be most adequately grasped if it is analyzed as an autonomous network or autopoietic system of communications. So basically, the autopoiesis of architecture is not looking primarily at the physical artifacts out there. And because the physical artifacts out there, in my definition of architecture, the artifacts out there, they're not all belonging to architecture. So the anonymous vernacular constructions around the world, and there are not that many anymore. There's in the advanced countries, there are hardly any left, or anything which is built new is designed by a professional architect, usually published in one way or another. There's hardly any building designed in the advanced world which isn't published and authored and so on. So, but let's say those vernaculars which are what I call tradition about building, where it's just a contractor doing something, or those don't belong to architecture. I don't count them as architecture, because I'm saying architecture is that self-conscious creation process and discursive process, which generates a number of, let's say, messages and articulations into the discourse, one of which is also physical constructed buildings. And they feed back into the discourse always through, of course, through photography and publication, but also through, visitations where you have openings, where a lot of architects and architectural critics will come to the site, and you have students of architecture visiting. And that is to be separated from the actual life process in society out there. These buildings are in fact communications within the discourse of architecture, as well as communications out there in larger society, namely then within the local communities or for those corporations, and out there in the societal environment. These buildings would be also still communications. They communicate, but they will be attributed to the clients, to the institutions. They will message, those institutions' intentions, and etc., etc. But what I'm focusing on with respect to this in volume 1 in particular is to describe that discourse of architecture in terms of all the types of communications which feed into it. What are the criteria of something becoming recognized and identified as a communication within the discourse? And that includes buildings, publications, texts, writings, lectures, but also talk. Not only lectures and public talk, but talk between architects, crit situations where you critique a student's work, or jury deliberations. All of that is part of that discourse which defines architecture, because there are a lot of colleagues who are not so much learning through reading a lot. I mean, we're not a reading discipline, but we learn a lot picking up in the office, maybe how we talk about buildings, what kind of arguments are made, what kind of ambitions are done. Also, you learn and what is rejected, what is condoned, and why. But particularly, more pertinently, a lot at schools of architecture, there's more talk per design than actually in offices. As many of you might know who have been working professionally, there's a lot of things that are understood, don't have to repeat it all the time. That's what I'm calling the architectural discourse, the autocracies of architecture. And what we're looking at when we're analyzing this, we have to look at, okay, what is going on? What are all the communications which are relevant? What are the criteria of success? What are the values which are brought to bear? What are the kind of legitimate arguments you can make to critique? And what are the media through which these communications are addressed? But also how we actually productivity within the field is generated through what is design in fact, and how we progressing designs, how we critiquing designs, design decisions, the media through which they are progressed, but also always that voiceover. So it's interesting that in architecture, that's why articles always have that text and image thing, and also the doodles, the little sketches which are commentary, which are teasing out and emphasizing aspects. You can point with your finger, you say this is where the problem is, or you make a little doodle and say this is where the problem. All of these communications. So what I'm saying, the autonomous network of communications, and this is a massive amount of material in the world of big data. One could in fact record that. You could have, you could run, all the lectures, all the communications, all the jury relations, they're all recorded. And you could record every step in the progress of a design as you add, draw lines, erase the lines, model and play with. All of these are design decisions. All of these are communications back to yourself, to the team, etc. Anyway, so that's the way I am looking at architecture. So it's not just the physical things are part of it, but they're standing next to the doodle, which critiques the building, and only to the extent that this physical building is mediated into the discourse is actually, I would refer to it as architecture. A building, an artifact, a structure which is just sitting somewhere and nobody ever talks to, looks at in terms of an architectural professional discourse and doesn't feed in, it therefore isn't part of world architecture. It just sits somewhere. If you design something for your grandmother's backyard, never publish it, never talk about it, never show it a colleague, you're not particularly proud of it, that's not architecture. That's not part of the architecture. And it makes a lot of sense, because architecture is that theory-led, self-consciously innovative. And that's one of the things I discover and claim, that all architecture has the aspiration to innovation, to a degree of originality, And then I'm also, the next thing I'm doing after I'm describing those constraints or what comes into the discourse, constraints on who can participate in the discourse, the kind of criteria, values, and structures of argument which are playing out. This initially is just a description. That's called a discourse analysis. The next stage is then to say, hey, well, is that rational? Are these good schemas of argumentation? Are these good? Is it good to have this evaluative layer? And how is that shifting from stage to stage? What's the rationality of all of that? Is this a good structured process? Or is that a process which has to be critiqued, improved upon? My general agenda here is to say, wow, look, initially we come to this with the let's say, we're not aggressively critical initially. We first of all should come with the humbleness and say, well, this is something which evolved for hundreds of years with so many contributors, talented and bright and hardworking. So initially say, let's not shoot from the hip and be quickly critical. Let's give it its due. Let's assume that there is something there. If it's so pervasive, and like Rambo said, something which is so pervasive might have an underlying rationality. So it must mean something. So that's my attitude. So my attitude is one of teasing out, even which seemingly irrational. For instance, the category of beauty has often been rejected and thrown out and say, why are we so fetishistic? Why are we talking about aesthetic conditions? Shouldn't we all throw this away? And I say, well, hang on a minute. Something like this has been going on for hundreds and maybe thousands of years, and is so pervasive, and also has been so intense as a selection criterion and concern within the work, for instance, my own lifetime at Untitled Architects. We don't dismiss that. It must mean something. There must be a rational kernel. So basically what I'm doing, I'm trying to functionalize, I'm trying to see what is the societal, social, rational and function of all these structures I'm starting to describe. Okay, so thesis 2, basically it's been implied in thesis 1, but I make it explicit as a statement. What is an assumption here? There exists a single unified system of communication that calls itself architecture, world architecture, and I call it the autopoiesis of architecture. Now, does it exist? Is that an integral whole to some extent? The first indication for this is that it has a name, that there is something we call architecture, and that there are all these people who call themselves architects and declare their interest and competency in architecture. So you sometimes could have, let's say, systems, which means you have repeated interactions, the reuse and continuous reuse of certain patterns of arguments, of certain types of action and critique. These would be a social system, but might not have a name. It might be a group of friends who might not be totally hermetic with a number of them, and there's a certain thing where you'll find that routine, you gather at the street corner, I mean, a group of youth, but they call themselves the X gang yet, but once they call themselves the X gang, that is an additional element of coherency. And they raise the question, is or isn't he a member? If there wasn't a name, there is maybe less strict questioning, so there's something important, that architecture has found its name for many, many 100 years. Architettura, Italian. I mean, so that starts with all the treatises of for hundreds of years of architectural theory have architecture in its title, and that's meaningful. And somebody like the late Mark Cousin used to say, and these labels, of course, they are contested. What's in there? What are the values in there? But everybody who's now fighting for to act in the name of architecture. That's what he's saying, that, you know, such categories are contested, and who is speaking and claiming the name of architecture. We have already a system. And what I'm saying here is basically a unified system in the sense that that includes all the different directions, all the different styles, all the different maybe contrary polemical positions. But since they are fighting it out, who is representing that prestige label, who is representing the way forward for architecture, they're all part of that unified system of communications. We know who is in there and who isn't. And what are the criteria? Some people might say something about buildings, but we say, well, this has nothing to do with architecture. They are talking about, you know, let's say they're talking about engineering, or they're talking about something else. They talk about the commercial aspects of this building. So that doesn't come in. That isn't relevant. So we have relevance criteria, and also we have credibility thresholds for participants. I mean, it's, you know, it's not very credible for somebody who has nothing, inverted commas, to do with the profession, comes in and suddenly tries to pronounce onto architecture. That's usually, you know, is easily dismissed or just simply ignored, not responded to. Anyway, so I think that unity exists, and that's all I'm demanding. I was talking yesterday strongly about convergence. Yes, it's great if that unified system of communication is unified just through the knowing what belongs and doesn't belong, if that always also develops a dynamic of, you know, filling in more concretely what the values are, what the criteria of success should be now, what's relevant and a thing to pay attention to with respect to designed artifact, and what is not important. So that we have a convergence of discourse, not only in terms of who is in there and who is in the ring, but that we actually start to cooperate rather than just fighting our corners. So that's the convergence idea, but it presupposes that we're identifying a domain, a discursive domain. And basically, I mean, we can't say it so radically, but let's say somebody who hasn't heard of Le Corbusier and cannot associate a notion or an image with the name Le Corbusier doesn't belong into architecture. Whatever he or she is saying has nothing to do with architecture. So that's, for instance, one thing I would contend. There are certain key references, paradigms, which, for instance, help us to define whether something or somebody belongs into architecture or not. All right, that was thesis 2. Thesis 3, the evolution of architecture. And this talks about architectural theory. Architectural theory affects an immense acceleration of architecture's evolution. This is a bit paradoxical. I should have said maybe immense acceleration of the built environment's evolution, because obviously, if I'm not calling things disconnected with architectural theory, not architecture, then this would be a tautology. So let's say architectural theory affects an immense acceleration of architectures, and I should rather say the built environments and the world of artifacts evolution. And that's what we're seeing, because we have that, we're shifting basically for that very, very slow tradition bound building where you think a little bit, you're more or less doing the same thing. You can't make any radical shifts because people would not understand you. You would not have anybody following you or giving consensus. You would just be an outcast if you start to do things deviant from any craft tradition. It would actually also be prohibited, and you don't have, in those periods before architecture exists, you don't have individual freedom. You have more these kind of very, very slow evolutionary processes. But with what I call the Big Bang of architecture, which comes with theory and importantly with full simulation of the artifact through drawing, because before the Renaissance, buildings weren't drawn up fully. There might have been detailed sketches for Gothic tracery or something. And basically the architect was also the stonemasons at the same time, who did the most difficult tracery elements and sculptures. But you know, there were maybe some sketches. It's very fragmentary, but basically you're staking out the dimensions and proportions and the rhythm directly into the ground, into the physical site, and then you build up. And of course you can only do that if there's a very, very strong preconception what the outcome is meant to be. So that used to be architecture. We don't have complete drawings. There might be fragmentary elements and maybe an overall outline, maybe a detail, but not a complete set of plans, sections, elevations, and the critical element, I think, which made architecture possible, perspective. That you can now, and that's what yesterday I was talking about, if you do something innovative and other, you have to explain yourself, but also how do you communicate what you trying to offer to your client, to the community, the municipality, the prince, you got to show for that perspective is very important. So, but of course, when you can radically innovate and show and draw and simulate something very, very new, then you don't have these tiny increments through which things gradually migrate from the Romanesque into the Gothic over 300 years. You can do something radically new within a decade or two, and you can map out a new city. You plot that, the ideal city, and you draw that up and some key buildings, and you have a perspective of it, and then you plot that out and build that. So anyway, so that's one of the effects of architectural theory, to have that enormous acceleration. But this is, modernity has these accelerations not only in the realm of the built environment development and urban development through theory and the professional discourse. This similarly happened with other domains, for instance, jurisprudence, where you have treatises of law and how to set up courts and a critique. I mean, a theoretical description, which then becomes recipes for reform. Similarly, political theory, starting with Machiavelli into Hobbes, Locke, etc. And then you can create something radically new. For instance, the American Constitution, and you generate a new country with a totally new political system, because you have theory, you have discourse, you have treatises which plot that out, plan that out, and think that through in detail. So this is not only architecture, in parallel, modernity, and it has to be realized, is moving ahead on multiple fronts because of this written and printed, very important, treatises to set up discourses, because then these books can be printed, can be disseminated, many voices can critique them and can publish on top the next treatise, etc. So it becomes cumulative and integrated. Before, you had these kind of manuscripts which might be in different parts of the world and they would never connect up, and it takes 300 years for the manuscript through several Chinese whispers rewriting to have an influence somewhere else. I mean, it did happen before printing to some extent, the works of Aristotle, etc. But the acceleration which comes through theory based on treatises, printing, in architecture is enormous. But it's not only in architecture, it's of course as well in political theory, in jurisprudence, legal theory. It starts also in terms of economic theory and economic reform and the dissemination of certain techniques of business. It also goes into, of course, the whole idea of technology and based on science and scientific papers and science interfacing with engineering and all of that. So the incredible acceleration of the modern world is based on that, not wholly, but it's a major important factor. And of course, it still is. So for me, it's just as a theorist, architectural theorist, and an architect investing in theory, pointing out how monumentally important and critical this is, and this continues, and that's why we have, you know, great architectural journals like the new one, Architectural Intelligence, and how important that is to push forward our competency and impact on the built environment, which we can't have if you stay, you know, isolated and doing things, you know, on the basis of what we learned maybe 30 years ago. Okay, so sorry, I'm jumping around here. So that means the necessity of theory. Architectural theory is integral to architecture in general and to all architectural styles in particular. There's no architecture without theory. And the discourse on styles will come, I will probably do it tomorrow. I'll come into it tomorrow or the day after. So it's not only because when you develop architectural theory forward, of course, when you do your treatise, you have a particular position you take. These are usually defending particular styles. Even, for instance, even Alberti is defending and promoting the Renaissance style, even though they didn't have that category at the time, although the category of style was started to integrate, not with the big epochal style, but with, you know, maybe a certain way of doing things imported from the writerly style. And you do have, obviously, when it comes to the versions of that translates to a series of treatises within the same idiom, and then you have, out of that, you move into mannerism and transitional style, and you move into the Baroque, and there's a series of treatises and polemics there, etc., etc. And the intensity of theory and the density and scope of theory keeps expanding. So, and I just want to mention the great Gottfried Semper, let's say in the mid-19th century, you're arriving at really monumental treatises, you know, many papers, and then the big book basically on tectonics and style, a 1000-page book. These are works which are compatible, let's say, to, I mean, you can compare it to, for instance, Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. Gottfried Semper is doing something similar, you know, explaining evolutionary explanation of all the phenomena of built environment and artifact production around the globe, and formulating a thesis out of this, which became very, very influential and set the path for modernism to come to light, you know, 50 years later. So the development of theory is also a trajectory of increasing theoretical intensity and the proliferation of many more treatises, maybe, you know, in the Renaissance and Baroque, and in the early 19th century or in the 18th century, you have very few treatises, textbook style treatises, but it really accelerates, and the scale and scope is increasing. Why? Because the complexity of the task, the complexity of society is increasing, and also the data and the material, the wealth of knowledge you're getting. For instance, Semper's building on the great exhibition of 1850 in the London Crystal Palace, basically, you know, the British Empire inviting exhibitors from around the globe. For the first time, you can see in one panorama the whole width of and breadth of let's say the global cultures of artifact production. Fascinating condition. Anyway, so at that point, architecture develops a very strong historical consciousness, which is very important then to think, okay, where are we going? This is where I've been coming from, and I can see a pattern of progress and transformation. So what's the next step? What's the next stage? So the question is, we are seeming to living in a new and kind of burgeoning industrial area. In which style should we build? So the concept of style was developed retrospectively, distinguishing the different cultures, the different eras, and then the question is, wow, and what's next? And that has been a very, very important to see. The category of style becomes a very important lever and catalyst for a strategic search of where the civilization is going with respect to the built environment and architecture. So again, showing how important theory is, because these kind of revolutionary transformation like modernism don't happen naturally without the discourse of architecture. I mean, we have the invention of steel and glass and industrial production, you know, in the late 18th century into the early 19th century, and basically it did impact very little. The cities look the same, the palaces, the houses, the museums, they're all built, you know, in the style of the Renaissance or neoclassicism, which is a version of it, and none of that impacted. Let's say a whole 100 years, no impact. Maybe there was something in the, you know, in industrial buildings where nobody was looking, which weren't recognized as architects, where you started to use cast iron elements. Maybe the only exception is railway stations, but there was the attempt to hide that new structure behind a big monumental stone facade. So you can see that naturally, without the discourse, pushing, querying, thinking through and making manifesto statements, there is no natural way, for instance, that modernism or modernization and the modern industrial look and feel of the built environment had to happen, would have happened. No, absolutely not. So for that, you need the theorists pushing, querying, questioning, making different options, discussing, and finally then inspiring also works which push that through. So the necessity of theory, and basically what I'm saying, the Discourse of Architecture is in charge of, you know, current production being best practice, but the main task is also innovation, innovating what's going on. That's really what we need the discourse for. Innovating, but then also once innovations are found, to proselytizing and rolling out these innovations, of generating that consensus, bringing everybody behind. That's another one. But so it's that kind of innovation, early adoption and rollout, ultimately summing up as cycles of innovation. They are generated in the discourse of architecture. And basically the importance of treatises, of written treatises, is very important. Later on, of course, individual articles can be very influential as well. It's not necessarily the big books. The big books, I mean, it's in the world of YouTube and design, etc. You know, they're not going to have much resonance. But I highly recommend that some of you still look at some of those books, because it will empower you to then be more potent and influential in your YouTube and you know, blog posts. 1 second, I need to remove some background noise, but you can already gear up for questions. Okay, sorry for that short interruption. So yeah, perhaps we can stop here and join the discussion, or open the discussion. So I will stop sharing here. No, wait, new share. No, wait, stop share. Okay. Right on. So how does it work, Philip? Are we inviting somebody else into the panel, or?
Yes.
Yesterday you said that.
Yeah. Maybe you have some question to you, because today I think it's more like several topics, including the autopoietic system you mentioned as the autonomous thinking process in the design, and goes to unity of architecture and evolution and the necessity of theory. I think I have a question raised firstly to you. You're talking about no architecture without theory, yeah? So it's like the theorizing, the practice is extremely important. So I mean, from still, I think it's like 6 lectures. It is still at the beginning to introduce the framework of your thinking, the fundamental background. How would you like to address your system? It's like your systematic thinking. It's on the one hand, it's really important. You try to define a unifying system of design, which can unify not only the geometry, but also including the social networks and a lot of communication, as you mean, introduce communication with the outside external system or external parameters, which could be introduced into the holistic system of your design. And still, it's your introduction about the evolution is I think is still from the Renaissance or from the Baroque. It's like still an evolution stylistic system of architecture, and which ending from the postmodernism and probably goes to the parametricism, as you mentioned. So is that special social background as this still, I think, is a stylistic, but it's interesting, it's quite successful in the past 15 years, especially in China, of Zaha style. I think you win a lot of competition, and there's super big public buildings, and which is like collective aesthetics, which accept by a lot of people. I think probably we want to figure out to tracing what's the initial background, as you mentioned. Is that a representation of the social networks, or is that the social relationship? Would you like to address your theory? So this kind of formalism, this kind of stylistic parametricism, actually, I think very strongly, probably in China, a lot of cities, project in Beijing, including airport, including Soho, Beijing Soho project, and including some other project in the Opera House in Guangzhou. I think all this building actually a representation of the social background, including the top-down government development into the economics, and also that kind of economics work in China. Actually, your design is quite attractive to the governor or to the government people, because it's quite a top-down system. It's not, as you mentioned, as a bottom-up process to generate the form, but actually the decision-making in China, probably they need some iconic figures in some super big project in terms of the economic investment. That is a great base on the capital process investment into the social process. I think from my understanding, the theory of Zaha office, include not yourself, but also including the whole office. Actually, could you analyze the early, like the mountain club designed by Zaha Hadid, which is the first building, which is quite based on the ontology, like the snapshot by different perspective angles of the helicopter, and it's like structuralism or destructuralism style. That's a collage of different angles, projective drawings, which generate this kind of unlinear forms, and which goes directly, as you mentioned, the parametric system, not just the geometry system, but also integrate the social system, social networks, and and at the same time is a formal style. So I want to probably, could you please analyze this kind of unity or this kind of heuristic you want to introduce, not only the geometry, the form, but also including the behavior performance, including the social performance into the geometry system. So could you analyze what's the background or the philosophy would you like to address into this process or into your theory?
Yes, yeah, I think that's a very important point. And when I will talk about my theory of styles, I will also refer to the way the different historical styles, the way they fit well with the historical era in terms of socioeconomic structure of that era. And so, for instance, just to very briefly summarize that, when we coming to so the medieval pre-styles, let's say the vernaculars of the Romanesque and maybe into the Gothic, which I call a transition, basically that's feudalism, right? And that feudalism fits very well with the guild frozen up craft traditions, which are tradition-bound buildings. So we look at, we're transitioning into the Renaissance, we're actually seeing that what the beginning of modernity. We start to see city-states which introduce capitalism, early capitalism, right? And they have double entry bookkeeping, they have more sophisticated business, land becomes available for sale, for entrepreneurship, etc., etc. So you have these so the Renaissance connects up with early capitalism. The Baroque comes in when we actually moving to the formation of a larger territory, a nation state in France as the first example. The Louis XIV, we have absolutism and we have mercantilism, a certain type of economic system which is very much controlled by the absolute monarch. He is controlling all the domains of the economy, is giving monopoly privileges to different groups. But it's a form of capitalism. It's called the pre-capitalism, mercantilism. That fits with the Baroque. We have these very, very large central administrative apparatus, like in Versailles. And if you build such a huge complex, Versailles with many buildings, Renaissance cannot deliver that. It cannot make an integral, a recognizably integral complex out of this, because it's very additive, with small parts having their own symmetry. And the Baroque is very much asymmetric parts delivering a powerful overall symmetry. And other elements of the Baroque for large integrated projects, for instance, deep relief, light and shadow, where you see from a distance, you have colossal order, columns going over several levels. All of that, you know, like when you look at the Vatican is another of those. The Vatican complex, the complex of Versailles, the Tuileries in Paris, and then from there on, all the German princes trying to imitate Karlsruhe. You have the Baroque city planning that fits with absolute power, basically disenfranchising all the feudal lords and concentrating power in the absolute monarch, and then regulating a centrally driven economy. So that makes sense for Baroque. Then we have the French Revolution, and we have also the Glorious Revolution in England. We have the bourgeoisie taking over. Basically, we have entrepreneurs, and we have the merchant classes. They taking over power, and they have a very different style. The Baroque disappears. You actually have the multiplicity of styles. You have the aesthetic of the picturesque. You have to allow degrees of freedom, many decisions accumulating in these sort of burgeoning industrial cities, totally exploding the boundaries of the Baroque city. So, and that is an aesthetic comes with that, and a certain pluralism of styles, historic. Anyway, so I'm just, and of course the modernism is the era of when this kind of laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century, which is connected with eclecticism, historicism, transforms into these, you know, all these thousand smaller companies 5,000 steel companies concentrate into 5 or 3 steel companies, these big conglomerates, very centrally organized, and mass factories, mass reproduction on huge scale. That's the era. And then you have social revolutions where these labor parties take over power, for instance, in Germany, and that's modernism. So there is always a very strong alignment. And obviously, yesterday I talked about, I don't want to repeat, how the contemporary condition is very, very different from the modernist condition, and we need a new. But when I'm talking style, as I said, it is, yes, it's the phenomenal geometric ordering appearance is very different, but underneath there are really deep functional, social functionality structures which make things look like. So obviously something which is the real driver underneath in terms of a selection pressure, that is the social functionality, and whatever that drives towards has a look. Now that's challenging the discipline, and the discipline sometimes is late in acknowledging, and some of these things happen outside. Even Rem was saying the periphery, if there's a lot of things going on which architects don't recognize. Architects still fall in love with these slender proportions of the modernist era before air conditioning and malls, and look what really happens outside architecture. So anyway, so that's where I wanted to say epochal style, they mean a lot in terms of socioeconomic and social systems. Now, when it comes to Zaha and us and the way we intersect with this. So what I think has happened, basically modernism was the centrally planned economy, these big conglomerates. In the West, maybe 3 steel companies, and then under communism, 1 steel, but it's not so hugely different, right? The fact is that around this Krupp steel factory, you have a whole city, and that's the modernists ready to do that. And in socialism, it just became more extreme. Now, this system is, we're in a very different system, where we realize, okay, this is very sterile, this is very suburban, this is, it can only do 5 products. And now we have these hugely faster cycles of innovation. We have computational reprogramming, we have diversification of lifestyles, and so on and so forth. We can do more, these niche productions, and that breaks up that modernist. And we have the reconvergence into historic city, and we have much more decentralized decision making. And that's, in a sense, postmodernism is that idea of collaging the new onto the old, having lots of diversity, expressing manifolds. And to express that manifold, they're bringing in all the different styles from the world, because they don't have enough imagination to create all this variety. They just find this variety, they're looking at the sterility of the modernist city, which is no longer giving them a wow factor of love and future orientation. It gives them a kind of monotony, no longer part of our world. And they look at some of these historical cities, and they just say, wow, there's a new paradigm. So we have collage city. And in a way, out of that developed deconstructivism, where they said the diversity is great, the collaging is interesting, but we can be more radical. We intersect, we layer on top whole systems, and we don't need to use old motifs. We can generate new forms. And that was the moment of deconstructivism. And if you look at, and what is, and I think deconstructivism and was a good premonition of what now parametricism it has. We still want that layering, that complexity, that adaptation. And in Zaha's work, you get a lot of interesting adaptations. So the Hong Kong peak you're mentioning, first of all, it's a very complex composition with many different beams intersecting, layering. They generate also a void. So it's this idea, which later on I'm talking about the mega atrium, and where you hollow out things. So the inside, intervisibility, interawareness, you already have that. And the void also has connections to the outside. That's one movement, complexity, voiding outs, where you get, let's say, that view of simultaneous, many things come into view in that central space, but also the adaptation to context. In this case, it's the mountainscape, but modernists usually they're thinking of a flat abstract plane. Their buildings are meant to be, you make a flat plane first and then you do your things. The spirit of let's say, deconstructors in Zahas, and then of course in parametrism is no, you look at the terrain, you not flatten everything, you work into it, you weave into it, you adapt to it, you affiliate, and that's already the idea of the peak, working with the levels and layers, drawing the contours, and then working with the contours and drawing the landscape and making the building to do certain degree continuous with it. So some of the themes which we now, for instance, correlation, adaptation, the opening up of this intensity of connections, visual connections and communication. These themes are already in the first major project of Zaha, but even before that, I think when Zaha joined OMA in 1980, it's 1979 in fact, sorry, she finished her school in 1977. She won the diploma prize, and that was an interesting complex project. She joined OMA, and they delivered a competition which they didn't win, but it was for the House of Parliament in The Hague, an expansion and extension job. So this was already, with respect to the brief, a inverted commas postmodern project, which then became an early deconstructivism project before the word deconstructivism was invented nearly 10 years later. So it's always that retrospective theorizing of what happened. But if you look at this project, I think it's very fascinating. I sometimes show it because it's basically a collaging and weaving into a series of new buildings into an old city structure with existing buildings, something which you find again and again in our work with Maxi, for instance, with the Serpentine Sackler, with Antwerp. We always love this integration. So you find that already, and the degree of complexity. And when Zaha took that one piece, connecting all the pieces, her part of the project. It's also interesting that there was multi-authors. So Ilya did a piece, Rem did a piece, Zaha did a piece, and her piece was maybe the most intricate, connecting all of the others together and allowing registrations of the others. So we have these themes, and of course it was more decon, but I'm trying to say there was continuities between decon and parametricism. I don't buy that, let's say, of course, when you bring something new, you are denying your elders. So the first parametricists, I mean, they didn't call themselves, they were called parametrism again 10 years later. But when they came out folding in architecture, they were denouncing and emphasizing the contrast with deconstructivism. And there were elements of contrast, but there were also strong elements of continuity. And I think that needs to be seen. That's the part of that dialectic which Hegel is talking about: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The antithesis is referring to the thesis and building on the thesis and seeing the limitations of the thesis. So that's what I find here. So when it comes to, these works early on show a lot of the ethos, the new set of agendas. And what I'm saying is that the agenda of parametricism, in terms of its social context, it addresses the kind of complexity of institutions. And the same, if you have a social club in the let's say in the 1980s, at this stage of society, is different from a club of the 1950s, which would be much more, the 1980s is much more dispersed, many places to go. They don't necessarily, they could be a whole variety of places and spaces, and the central space isn't a symmetrical, isn't a very clear. It's a very complex and varied thing where the boundaries are blurred. So I think that matches the kind of life. If you remember, I mean, let's say Philip Yuan, you remember, I don't know when you were growing up in the 1970s, it was a very different world at university. But I'm telling you that somebody like Zaha, I mean, the 1950s in Europe were not very different. If you go to university, there is basically the professor is God, and everything is super hierarchical, everything is super ordered. And there's never many options, not many degrees of freedom. So that was still the 1950s, and the big thing was obviously the you know, the late 60s into the 70s open up a lot of that into in the Western countries, and you in China, you experience that these kind of explosion of degrees of freedom, that radical change in the 1990s, right? So it's about 20 years shift. It took 20. So that's the new social conditions, and to some extent, what is nice for us that we can feel, I mean, the energy of China, the entrepreneurship, the dynamism of the cities, and you see entrepreneurs like, you know, Zhang Xing and Mr. Pan of generating fantastic new ideas for their buildings, and we, you know, being in central locations and networking. So that's where I think we are fitting well. We're well prepared. So we matured. I mean, Zaha and then myself, I joined in the late 80s, early 90s. Zaha was starting in 10 years earlier. But the themes, the new societal dynamics of decentralization, of degrees of freedom, of entrepreneurship, of layering and intensification of communication, you know, they're very similar themes. So for instance, when you in the 1950s, and then China was the same, but it continued until the you know, late 70s, you don't need to communicate much laterally between units, because there is one plan and the command line of command, and so on the ground you don't need to exchange ideas and communicate. You just do what work through, and everybody is beavering in parallel, all integrated through a central plan that works well if you have only 5 things to do, and these 5 things you're optimized already and you're doing for the next 20 years. Now we have a condition where that center says, no, we don't know what we have to find out. We have shop floor innovation. We have each department making connection with outside suppliers, with outside expertise, you know, with this university research, and you have to commute. I mean, it's like, you know, now we're talking and meeting, you know, most of our day, hardly have any time to concentrate at work. And before it was the opposite. And that means certain types of spaces, certain types of conditions, which we can bring to China. And the China is what is refreshing is that there's those pockets and opportunities where you can do a lot of innovative, great work. But there's, of course, also an environment where there's still a lot of central planning, a lot of contradictions. But for us, it was very, very exciting to do. And you saying is I mean, you get this idea of iconic landmarks. Yeah, sometimes there isn't necessarily with decision makers. I mean, I think that the decision makers who are the entrepreneurs, who are living and breathing their product, these are the best projects. So if you're working for entrepreneurs like, for instance, Infinitus company, or if you're working, I mean, or you imagine to work for somebody like Tencent, we're currently in the competition, they know, they have great buildings already. They know what they're living and breathing, and they're not necessarily interested only in the icon as such. They're interested in how that building breathes and lives. I mean, like that building, for instance, Shenzhen of Tencent is a great example, for instance. So I think sometimes, yes, there is a superficial selection. They want something looking kind of strange, and you know, and then there is ambivalence about this. But I think CCTV is one of those projects which I think, I don't know what current situation is. You know, who made the decision initially? Then it was Chichiguagua, and it was difficult. Of course, we had a fire, which was another problem. But I think, for instance, CCTV, I think it's compared to just a flat tower, is an amazing, I think, project to live and work in for a TV company. My feeling, and it's not just and somehow the iconic expression, I still defend it, and you symbolize and says, hey, there's something different going on. This institution wants to project, you know, we trying out something different, but also the functionality of these deeper and larger spaces, of these sectional connections, and to make that in a city where you can't go horizontal. I think these are, yes, they're iconic, but I defend the symbolism to some extent. If it symbolizes And but it's also in really a functional form which delivers organizational performance and makes it legible where you might want to go and so on. I think legibility issues are part of performance, but so that's the way I would pitch it. And you're saying stylistic. Again, I mean, the problem I often have, and I don't know if I regret or shouldn't regret using the phrase style. I could have only talked about paradigms, and I wouldn't have that issue. But when you talk about paradigms, what you miss out is that the look and feel and the recognizability and the appearance, the way it makes transparent what's going on, is missed out, is not so foregrounded. And also, I think paradigm is a borrowed concept coming from the sciences, whereas the concept of style is a genuine concept of our field. And now it's been trivializing, or it seems to do with superficialities, but as I explained earlier, the concept of style, which emerged first in the history of architecture, and then became part of the contemporary project of reinventing architecture. I don't think we would be in the place where we are today through the refoundation of the discipline. Modernism was the great revolution in architecture. I don't think it, although some of the modernists ended up rejecting the concept of style, without the concept of style, there wouldn't be modernism. If you read the history of the early 20th century, in which style should we build? We, the new generation, the new era, how should we, what's our style? And that was incredibly important. And then I was talking about Semper, and I'm talking about other protagonists which come in, and where you have Muthesius and Wagner, and a lot of these treatises have the concept of style in their title. Mose Ginsburg, the Russian theorist whose work in Paris Corbusier, style and epoch. So we can't deny the concept. And it's also made sense to Le Corbusier, by the way. And of course, we have backlash and questioning, and do we need it? But then look at the end of the 1920s, we suddenly have the international style by Hitchcock, Russell, and Philip Johnson as another milestone. And of course, it was controversial, but I'm defending it. So I have good historical pedigree of relying on the concept of style, but of course I have to, and that's been the hard thing, I have to wash away, peel away that superficiality, which I think it's a very deep concept, and it doesn't mean to point to superficialities. It means to point to very deep, basically it's the exact equivalent of a paradigm. Basically, the concept of style is a genuine, original, created concept of our field, which is the equivalent of the concept of paradigm in the sciences, which came later. And why should we borrow a concept if we have our own genuine, potent concept, by the way, which everybody in the universe, let's say lay end user and everybody in society understands. I don't think they understand the concept of paradigm, but they understand it. Maybe they have a superficial understanding, but it means something.
Yeah, it's not about superficial. I think parametricism is extremely important, especially in the history. At the beginning of this century, you put forward this idea, and that goes on around 15, 20 years. And we can figure out the history, and also in China we strongly experienced the Zaha office strongly growing, but actually the practice of the office is quite different compared to the early work, and we want to figure out the difference. Probably at the very beginning is kind of I remember I met in Berlin, AIDAS. They talking about the early exhibition. I think one of the first exhibition of AIDAS gallery, they actually invite Zaha to make an early exhibition and showing a lot of sketches and also the hand drawings and also the renderings. I think I like these images. I think it's kind of imagination or kind of critical thinking at that time to predict what will happen next as early work of Jaha office. And then I think your contribution is actually connecting the social process and the social understanding, and to analyze, I think a new, it's quite, I still name it a new formalism, I think, which strongly strongly connecting to the early sketches, or the, I think it's kind of hand drawings from Zaha Hadid at very beginning, but it goes to, I think this style have some very strong influence to
yeah,
the,
I mean, absolutely. I mean, if I may say something to that. So first of all, yes, I am defending, I mean, Jeff Kipnis was the one who was putting, I mean, formalism has been the negative connotation, a derogatory term for many years in architecture. We just say dismissing, oh, that's just formalism. And of course, if you if there was somebody who was just falling in love with some forms without reflecting the performance of these forms, yes, that would be rejected. So I accept that you could say it like this. What Jeff was trying to say, he was kind of putting it on the banner and saying, we are formalists. And what I accept here is that there's a certain division of labor where you can do, let's say, formal research, where you are temporarily forget about the performance and just generate fresh formalisms, fresh formal systems. For then, maybe the problem is, obviously we say that's all we should do. Like Eisenman would have maybe said, architecture should become like abstract music. It should forget about content and forget about function. That's up. I mean, that's obviously totally unsustainable. But this mindset is actually quite productive to have in the field, where somebody is, because if you want to generate new formalisms, and at the same time, you want to make sure that what you're producing there is performing, you're not going to generate much new stuff. So you have to decouple, you have to work in phases. You have to have that phase of formal proliferation and research inverted commas, it's artistic proliferation. You can use it by hand, you can use it by frottage and various mechanical graphic processes, which we did in the late 80s actually. And you can do it computationally by running, you know, processing or any other set of algorithms without thinking too much. But what is important is that some structural features of those formalisms are not in their specifics. In the specific, we don't have a program, we don't have a function, but as a generic type of feature are fitted quite well. For instance, gradients. Zaha was early on into gradients. So you can make various gradients purely formalistic, just to tease out how, you know, how quickly can you transform, make a transition, or how long drawn out can you do it before it becomes imperceptible, and can you do it in two directions at the same time? This is formal research without any, but it is heuristically well set out, because we know on another plane that gradients are very useful devices for organizing contemporary social processes, because for instance, in an urban field, you don't want just have one zone here and then bang, and another one here. You might want a gradual in-betweening, because there's many different more conditions you can generate, and you can also make it navigable through local field qualities. There's many advantages to gradients, and that if you've learned in an abstract study that you can have gradients in two directions, or you have two gradients layered at the same time, one encompassing a larger trajectory, another one faster and slower. That's formal research. These are formalisms, and I'm absolutely subscribing to them, but it's not the end game. I can't say, like with Eisenman and Kipnis, they're totally wrong if they say, well, that's all architecture should be, and everything else is boring stuff for the pragmatist. I'm sorry, that's not gonna work. But I
Patrick,
respect you. I let you work in your false consciousness, and but I'm looking closely. I know you don't have the right theory and self-description where you're placed in the history of architecture, but I watch you closely, and so on and so forth. So I think that Zaha was basically a great formalist with an incredible amount of innovation on formal research, but she wasn't like Kipnis and Eisenman, where she said, well, that's all it is. And I don't have to build, you know, and I don't have to make it applicable. She said, no, architecture is, you know, ultimately invested in the better life, the progress of society. So she wanted things to mean something, and she had the intuition that they could, you know, and that's what the way I think this evolved. And of course, we also have to realize that, yes, the early sketches were, I mean, they were more in the research form. And later on, not that we don't do research, we're doing a lot of research, even formal research, but what becomes visible, of course. Like if you have nothing else to show in the 1980s, you just show these sketches, doodles, and drawings, because you don't have buildings to show. So, and but we should still. I mean, recently it was quite beautiful that somebody like Tom Main from Morphosis now is going back to formal research in models and using AI and so on. So I don't think it ever stops. And I've been using a DRL. I mean, we always start with formal systems. We never start. We're talking about a heuristic form to program. So we keep doing it, but it's not so visible anymore. When what foregrounds now is the final build product, but that's really what it's all about in the end. But you don't have to do it yourself. So I expect contributors. That's why we have a big discourse with the division of labor of aspects within it. So there could be people within it who are never translating into buildings. There are others who don't do the formal research, but they're good at picking up things and then scaling up. I respect all of that. We need all of that. And but of course, the evolution of the work it has been happening with respect to all the new tools we're integrating. That whole transformation from into early parametrism into folding blobs and then early parametrism, these proliferations through, let's say, generative components, the way you're kind of migrating and transforming systems of elements on skins or on cities. These have been, and then into tectonism, which is all these beautiful new tools which integrate much stronger with engineering and fabrication constraints. All of these are evolutionary steps. And when I step back, I can see I always prefer the later versions. I mean, I think they're more even on the aesthetic sensibility. So I would find the latest works, which are works of tectonism with this precision and iteration, more diverse, more rich, more beautiful, and you can also do larger complexes without becoming monotonous within them. And then I have a lot of criticism for most of our build works. I have a lot of not really regrets. I mean, and you know, I'm happy we achieved what we achieved, but also we would have wished to achieve so much more, because we have a clear vision of progress, and the later stages are always the more sophisticated stages. And I think that's something which, if you wouldn't believe that, and you start becoming nostalgic about your early works, I mean, Patrick, something is wrong. Maybe the point of retirement has arrived, but I don't feel like that.
Patrick, I think why we invite you to make the lecture series is because we want to show the respect to your theory and also respect to your practice. In the past 15 or 20 years. I think that's why we invite you coming to this lecture series. Actually, after you, just 1 hour later, Peter Eisenman will give another lecture. And tomorrow, after your lecture, will be John Fraser give another lecture. So it's every day we have 2 lectures, but I think that's showing our respect to all your guys, to your contribution to the academic in the past 10 years, 20 years, and gave to the academic world, actually, which influenced a lot to us. So that's why we want to argue a lot of things about your thinking and what you're doing. So we have some question from the students. I think we have a PhD student.
Yeah, there's a question here.
Yeah,
let me
Thank
read
you
that.
for the
So
yeah,
in the Q&A, I have Daniela.
Yeah,
we have
actually,
a,
Patrick, I think they
you can just
unmuted
read that out.
Yeah, actually, I want to say a little bit more about that. So I think very broadly, I'm asking about how you were writing the Autopoiesis of Architecture, especially achieving the complexity of the articulation in the process of aiming to articulate complexity. And I think a lot of that maybe has to do with extensive description and also this very strong structure, very detailed structure of the table of contents and of course the theses. And I guess my question, because I'm a student and a lot of us are students writing right now, is how that organization came about. Like, was this cohered post facto or was it mapped out kind of as an outline? I know you've told me before that you kind of wrote it in smaller chunks or articles. So I wanted to find out a little bit more about that, if you could please elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, so some of the insights had been gathered over the years, and some of them had been written in articles beforehand. Obviously, I mean, when I was writing the parametricism articles, I already was way ahead in the development of the book. So the book basically, I started conceiving and writing it in the late 90s, or let's say around 2000, I suspect. And so it took it took about 10 years to bring it to publication and to build it up. So volume 1 and then volume 2 took another, I mean, was way ahead, but I had so much. I discussed basically the overall manuscript became so large, and also we wanted to come out with it, so that we decided to split it into 2 parts. So basically, yes, I think it is a lot of insights, partial insight, partial theories. So, developing, the importance of socioeconomic eras and epochs, and as being deriving or being rationals for stylistic transformations, and so that theory of style started to emerge earlier. The interest in understanding, for instance, things which come through a lot in volume 2, that the new post-Fordist network society, the post-Fordist restructuring. I was particularly interested in the corporate transformation. There was a lot of literature in corporate reorganization, particularly throughout the 90s. It actually starts in the late 80s, the post-Fordism discourse, which is coming out of Marxism, which is a lot about this kind of idea of decentralization, of self-organization, of participatory and bottom-up social structures, the information processing, etc. So that idea and what that meant for space. And I saw the congeniality between what came out of folding and with these new socioeconomic and organizational dynamics that was set up. Basically, the founding of DOL was based on that, basically saying that here we have this American formalist, purely formalist research and discourse through out of the Eisman office, and then Greg Lynn out of the Eisman office becoming independent, and you had and Jesse Reiser and the protagonists of folding and feeding off with the work of Zardid architects. And then you had so that formalist school was one thing I observed, and I was sensitized, of course, to the importance of this. And what is interesting for me, that let's say in terms of Zardid, we had all these formalisms developed even pre-computation to large extents, like gradients and distortion and adaptations and so on. But what I realize is very important is the importance of coining new phrases, neologisms, building if not a full theory, coming up with new terms to describe that, to pin it down, to then say more of that, please. So something like continuous differentiation, something like single surface, something like, I mean, and then a lot of the words coming out of Deleuze was also interesting. Deleuze and Guattari, 1,000 Plateaus. And you can see that if you pick up words from the Deleuze-Guattari and you get inspirations, actually, even if the protagonists don't see the social content, they just see the formalism. Deleuze and Guattari, indirectly, there's social content, historical transformational content in there. So I realized that, and then I looked at the same time at the Dutch, who are very much driven by, let's say, an anti-formalist, but a pro-programmatic stance, and also in Schumi, cross-programming, you know, intersecting and programs. They were into the social process and programs, but they didn't think that this deserves any new form. They were just using boxes to do this. So basically, I put these two hostile strands together and said, that's the research program, the American formalism and the Dutch programmatic innovations. I fuse them, and DRL would be that design research lab which connects up and instrumentalizes the new formalisms for the new social and societal dynamics. And we're using things like the corporate restructuring as a domain, because there you get a lot of, you know, the similar phrases, blurring of boundaries, talking about a social organizational condition, and at the same time we're talking about bleeding and morphing and blurring of boundaries in architecture. So so I was aware of a lot of themes, started to write a series of articles. I don't know how many I'd written by the time I started the book. And then, you know, basically the main thing which allowed me to cohere it all is that I was reading the theories and works of Niklas Luhmann. That's where a lot of the structure of the autopoiesis is coming from, for volume 1, not so much volume 2. And basically, because I was seeing that in Niklas Luhmann, there's been a great attempt to describe but I now just realize that architecture is this kind of function system, that autopoietic discourse, systems communication in charge of a particular part of the societal progress. And Luhmann has described that with respect to the political system, in a political ordering of social processes, the legal system, the legal ordering of social processes, and the economy, etc. He has all these descriptions, and he developed a series of categories and questions, which I tried out with respect to architecture. So, you know, the question is, are there certain binary codes which determine what is inside and outside the discourse? Legal, illegal for instance, in the jurisprudence discourse. Well, yeah, we have such binary concepts where we're saying, for instance, beautiful, ugly, or formally resolved, formally unresolved, or we're saying things like functional, dysfunctional. So we have these binaries, and if what you're saying isn't addressing the binaries, it falls out. And there's many other things I don't get into, but basically what helped me, and it might also help you guys, that you take a model of a sophisticated, comprehensive theory. You can learn how to build a theory and how to integrate a theoretical edifice. And also, of course, in this case, it's interesting. It's not only is the individual, let's say, discourse analysis, he doesn't use that phrase, of the different function systems became models for my discourse analysis of architecture as a function system. But also on top of it, he has the overarching historicizing theory of society. So I could also plug this in underneath that umbrella, because I do believe that architectural theory must be embedded into a theory of society, because architectural theory's task is to adapt and progress and upgrade what the discourse of architecture, in terms of its contribution of development, the built environment, is contributing to the overall historical progress. We need to know what that is and how the rest of society functions, so that we relate our discipline properly to all the other aspects and disciplines. So that was a great help. So I had all the individual insights and contents, and I can then start to fit them into the Luhmannian system of questions and categories. And then I would also probe and see, you can find there certain blanks. There were certain questions and certain concepts. somewhat nearly obvious, since he said all of these function systems have a genuine new medium through which they're communicating, and that medium helps a lot in making what he calls the improbable probable. So for instance, the economy has the medium of money. Political power has the medium of, political system has the medium of power, meaning some kind of relationship of instruction, of subordination, which is a medium which you can quite widespread and free to use. Once you're the boss, you can use it to instruct all sorts of things to yourself. But within certain limits. Anyway, so the concept of medium became something which had to be part of every function system. So I said, oh, well, clearly we have the medium of the drawing and then digital model, and ultimately connecting with the medium of space. So this is the way the autopoiesis was constructed. I think that's why it also has a lot of originality and some strangeness, because Luhmann's work is also particularly innovative. But also the ethos, when Luhmann is writing his theory, he's not just reinventing everything. He's also absorbing a lot of, for instance, if he writes the, inverted commas, he didn't call it, the autopoiesis of the legal system. In his title of these books is The Legal System of Society. He is, of course, trying to distill the wisdom and insights and theoretical let's say, structures which had evolved in jurisprudence. And similarly, when I'm writing the Autopoiesis of Architecture and the discourse analysis, is using these categories and ordering principles of Luhmann, but what I'm bringing in is all the history, the theories of architecture and the themes and topics and insight which architecture has accumulated all the way to the contemporary. I'm bringing that in, so it becomes that big sponge of absorbing and filtering a lot of insights. You might, that's not immediately obvious. You think I'm so trenchant and radical and novel with what I'm saying, but no, a lot of what I'm saying is validating ways of working and insights. And only when in the forward look, so in the backward look, I'm largely, in a sense, saying, wow, let me understand how we have achieved that, all these feats and these sophistication, and how does it all make sense? A kind of validation looking back, but then looking forward, it becomes more trenchant and I mean, but also not on my own. That I was part of a whole movement. I said yesterday, the whole generation, which should have naturally taken over the field. So it wasn't an isolated trajectory, but they're still looking forward a lot of, I'm highly selective. I mean, looking backward, I absorb most of the history of architecture because those dead branches are actually no longer in the big story. But going forward, we need to select the right branch. And that's where it becomes more trenchant, let's say. And I'm also making my original contributions over and above at that point in volume 2, over and above what the movement of parametricism has in view. So I'm trying to educate, inverted commas, or expand the scope of the movement of parametricism into domains that has not many people are touching. For instance, the interest in phenomenology, the interest in semiology, the integration of more systematic innovations in organization theory, the whole space syntax should be integrated, as well as then developing new tools in terms of the social simulation, etc. So I'm also making my original contribution when it comes to when I'm moving from a great systematizing of what was achieved, then a systematizing of what the movement has achieved and stands for in the theory of parametricism, into, let's say, parametricism 2.0, and into tectonism, which is also something which I did, which I'm just observing and bringing in, but I'm adding my original elements to that. But again, you can see something like tectonism, which is a big manifesto, but hey, tectonism is not what I've created. That's all the work of, it's also partly in our office through code, but it's Philip and, Philip, all the people who are speaking here are the great protagonists of that. So I mean, I'm very careful I'm not a standing alone. I want to be part of a collective trajectory and make my, contribution in largely it's been my role to summarize, systematize, put labels on it. And I realized, it is a lot of people don't like labels, but it's been important. When architecture actually discovered that that there's a label, that's the same. And that's important. That also, I think the movement has a name, and all other movements found names for themselves. The metabolists, when they're talking about the metabolists, or the postmodernists, Charles Jenks said that he wasn't loved for it, but it helped a lot. Of deconstructism, loved Philip Johnson and Mark Wigley for inventing these labels. No, but was it helping? Of course it was.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you. We have one more question here in the chat room. Thank you for the lecture. Would you like to ask for your opinion on everything that isn't planned but constitutes to the overall experience and functionality of the built landscape, such as appropriation of space, remodeling in accord to the needs of owner, or an urban scale, the commercial street signs, for example, or anything that isn't predefined by architects, designers, or the set of rules?
Yeah, I think that's a very profound question, and I've been grappling a lot with that. Okay, so it's a very interesting problem to think about. So when we started, one of my great, I think, let's say, our intuitions was, for instance, the idea of parametric urbanism, right? So when we first developed, when people was playing with swarms and with generative components, where they were populating facades with differentiating components, the idea that we could apply that to a landscape and have these kind of gradient transformation correlating to conditions of the landscape in terms of slope and steep or proximity to rivers, and let these drivers, that was a great intuition. And it seemed this leads us to needing this kind of monumental control over the whole of the urban landscape, as designing it basically like Le Corbusier did. And I think that was a big contradiction, unresolved contradiction at the heart of parametric urbanism, let's say. So I was struggling with this, and I do think if you have, and nobody is really asked these days to design whole cities, but we're doing master plans. And the first way I thought about this in terms of reconciling myself with some of these master planning jobs. If you come in and there's a number of people competing for master plan, you're putting down a network, a parcelization, a grid of circulatory systems. So, and the traditional thing would just be a neutral grid or an axis with a series of Sibiu axes. And then, the grid would then say, okay, everything is free for all. And the axis would say, well, it's not all free. We need to put something at the end, and here, and it's a more structured whole. Now, when we came in, we have, let's say, we have soft grids, and we have differentiations and correlations to existing textures. So we're still doing a master plan. Now, if you compare it, if you need, you probably need, if it's a large site, several hectares or square kilometer, you need some kind of plan structure to fill in, to work out. People also need to see what they're participating in. So in that sense, I think there was a degree of legitimacy in doing something, at least compared to others. So if we start, for instance, in Singapore with a soft grid, the variation of parcel sizes, and then we let the market play on that, then at least there's more choices. There's choice of big ones, central, peripheral, and there's also a correlation between size and centrality. So you can infer things, and they're ordering. There's a self-sorting and self-ordering process through the market. There's a better substrate. So I think we're not determining everything, we determine something. So, and to think further, more and more I was thinking about it, the more I think we need to try to withdraw and give a maximum scope to the self-organization process of urban entrepreneurs. Now, that needs a different political system, but I was interested in this multi-author, evolving identity of a city, path-dependent, self-organizing, emergent, etc. These are very interesting quests. Now, how are you dealing with this? As an architect, you have to maybe put the substrate down and run a number of simulations and be also ready that there's a lot of, let's say, unexpected, unpredictable ways of handling with this, but there's maybe some robustness underneath which continues. So I'm very happy to say that the final placement, what I reject is strict land use plans. I think that the land use distribution and land use plans must emerge from what I call the self-organization of co-location synergies. Every entrepreneur must be free to purchase a site and find the best site for their project, or the developer can try to look at the market and see what kind of product and program should fit here, because we don't have a lot of harsh negative externalities, because we're not talking about anymore having polluting industries in the middle of an urban field. These are I mean, they are separated out. We're not talking about, we're talking about the city of the knowledge economy. So I'm very much interested in this, in trying this out and inviting many authors. The architect is coming in for me in this way. There's an initial substrate, a default differentiation, a default structure, which is also very parametric and adaptive, where you can subdivide or you're allowed to consolidate parcels. There should be a lot of degrees of freedom, but it's better than absolute nothingness, which doesn't inspire, which doesn't have any pre-structuring. So I believe in a kind of loose fit, a versatile field of engagement. And then when it comes, the role of the architect then is when the entrepreneurs are coming in and finding their spots and finding each other, most importantly, with respect to who they want to connect up with, as this community itself discovers, and maybe also some mistakes, somebody, you have some substitutions in the process as well. As there's this kind of self-organization process, the architects come in and articulating the various buildings and express through their build form the identity and affiliations with neighboring buildings. And there you need to hope for architects, the whole disciplines coming in. And if we could rely on a unified epochal style, a set of values, for instance, everybody understanding the value of differentiation and versatility, the value of correspondence and resonance as affiliation, that you would seek for those, you would seek for embeddedness rather than abstract difference and collage conditions, which become quite quickly, garbage spill urbanization, as I call it. If we had, the architect would then weave something in a dialectic process with the entrepreneur. So the use cases, the land uses, and the programs, and also the dimensions and maybe densities coming out of the individual entrepreneurial, but the articulation of these, then knowing who the neighbors are to some extent, you then weave something and stitch something together, which is very crafty, expressing these synergies, expressing these, let's say, the differences and similarities, and what your client wants to be connected to and seen to be part of in terms of other buildings, and what they want to contrast themselves from. So we need to work out, let's say, and we are the articulators, the form givers to the social processes which emerge, not through our imposition. And anyway, architects rarely have done that. Sometimes they've done that with the backing of political power, where you have some of the modernist architects, they were the city architects, Van Eester and the city architects of Rotterdam, etc. You had people like Ernst May as the city developer of Frankfurt. This came with centralized political power. This is a different era. We shouldn't even want that. We shouldn't be this kind of, we shouldn't have the kind of fantasies of grandiose artistic creations on the scale of a city. That's obviously totally preposterous. But I think that we as a collective, a process through our peer criticism, peer critique, and an establishment of everybody participating in generating that new intricate identity and urban functionality, urban social functionality in a process which could be decentralized. You can have many different people working on it, and but when you come in as an architect, you have to pick up where your colleagues left it. You are confronted with these conditions, and you need to affiliate and resonate and embed in it. You cannot say, forget all of this, I'm doing my thing. That we should say, sorry, that's not sophisticated. That's not what we're allowing for. You are not a good colleague. You will not win this competition. You will not win any prizes. You will not be talked to. So that's the way we get the force of discursive set of values and peer pressures. That's the way we get coherency into it. But it is a bottom-up process, nevertheless, even if in each individual intervention in that decentralized process, highly sophisticated, highly informed, and take many conditions. Similar in the economy, everybody is doing the individual market decisions, but highly informed by big data collections, by economic models, by details, by theory. Every single investment, every single investment decision is theory informed with the most sophisticated and latest consultants and data analysis and evidence-based models when they do their final intervention. The similar should be in architecture. We need to say, I like this. No, you come in and you have the full scanning of the data set, you intricate analysis, sophisticated tool sets, theory, and then you're respectable in your, we respect you if you do this, and we all feel, wow, and you can be original and innovative about it, that you take in account further resonances, different layers of conditions. That's the way we can do it. And you see, it's a dialectic of we are in charge of certain aspects, but a lot of the drivers we need to pick up and be sensitive to allow them to come through. But we are the ones who are giving shape. We are allowing them to come through. And a colleague just can't allow them to go through because they don't have the antennas, they don't have the processes of translation. They can only bring a hammer and say, here I am, guys, love me or leave me, So that's bankrupt, and we need to reject these kind of ways of working. We should eject them out of our let's say, precious discipline.
Great. I think it's Patrick, today is almost here. Thanks for your profound thinking and deeply introduce your thinking and your theory. I think today is interesting, which based on a lot of thesis, short essays, maybe, which integrate together to be two books. So we're looking forward tomorrow. And so
thanks everybody. Great questions, by the way. It really charged me up. So I'm really happy. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow. Yeah. See you tomorrow.
Okay. Bye.